All right. So, hi, Aida. Thank you so much for joining today on the Holistic Hub podcast. This has been a long time coming for me in particular because I have been wanting to interview you and just like pick your brain about environmental chemicals for a long time now. So, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's not often that I get to, talk about nerdy things like endocrine disruptors and chemicals and, so I'm always happy to. So thank you for having me.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad that you're on the podcast today. So, you have so much wonderful information on your blog, your newsletter, and your Instagram, where you're very active. You're always sharing such wonderful information. So, this always leads me to starting every podcast episode with just asking, what got you started in all this? Because I can tell, and I'm sure that your followers can tell too, you're very passionate about this topic. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your story and what got you involved.
Yeah, of course. Well, I actually started what is now my company, Through Little Plums. It started with a different name before,
Mhm.
about 15 years ago. My oldest son is 14, and it was when I was pregnant with him. Prior to that, my background was in investigative journalism. So I've always loved researching. That's what you do when you're an investigative journalist. And my mom actually had breast cancer about 20 years ago. So when she went through that, she kind of would always email me in her own research. She would email me, little notes and things that she was finding linking environmental toxins to potential breast cancer. This was 20 years ago. There wasn't that much information out there. And honestly, I was in my 20s and I would read them, but wouldn't really pay attention as sometimes you do when you're young. But when I
Definitely.
did get pregnant, suddenly I remember my sister, I have an older sister, and she's like, well, you have to get an organic mattress. And that kind of, I was like, well, why, right? Why? What's an organic, what is that? So then I started researching, and the more I researched, the more my eyes opened up to the fact that there are environmental toxins in everything. We're exposed to these toxins every day and they're not regulated. I always thought that the powers that be were, making sure that things in stores were safe, and that's not so. So I started researching and researching and just putting things down. It was mostly to share with friends at first, so I started a blog just to get my thoughts right and not forget anything. And eventually, I started working with families one on one. I've worked with companies to help them, create sustainability or chemical restrictive chemical lists, or, help them find better ingredients. And it's grown to a community nowadays, which is Three Little Plums. And I think my passion has really, it's always been with children. I have three children, but beyond that, children are always the most vulnerable, not only to environmental toxins, but it's just, I always feel for them because you don't want to see a sick child. So I'm really passionate about helping and empowering people, mostly parents is who I work with, to be able to provide a healthier home, but also without stressing out. And I think that's my focus. That's where I found my niche is I'm not someone who's going to tell you, throw everything out. You need to live in a bubble. This is all toxic. It's a toxic world. Because I find that, anxiety really doesn't help. Usually people give up, they get frustrated. I'm very much a proponent of small steps and little, and then it's really a lifestyle. It's not like you're doing like this non-toxic diets because we all know these like, restrictive diets don't work, right? When you're
Mhm.
eating or wanting to lose weight or live healthier. So you can't do that with your life. You really need to do like a lifestyle change. So slow steps. But yeah, but that's basically where I am today. That's what I try to teach people and kind of just educate them and empower them. I know that I'm not always there with them when they're in the store. So I want people to understand and just feel empowered to ask questions and just understand what's better, better products, better choices. And it's really easy. I think that, that's like one of the things that I get most excited about. When I work with people, often, at first they are overwhelmed. That's why they arrive to come work with me. And then after a while, they're like, oh, no, no, this makes sense. Oh, yeah, and then within a year or two, it all becomes much more like just more obvious in a way for them. So it becomes a very easy lifestyle choice.
I love that you kind of laid the groundwork by stating that it's important to take those small, easy steps, because I remember when we started trying to make swaps about, like, gosh, it was like 6 or 7 years ago. Like, we're relatively newer, I guess, in the grand scheme of everything in terms of like when we started making our swaps. And I remember feeling so overwhelmed because I looked to every single room and I was like, oh my goodness. But then I realized you just have to just learn the information, like I know we're going to dive into today,
Yeah.
and then just make the swaps where and when you can. Like, for example, if like your soap bottle of whatever chemicals are in there
You run out.
is running out, right? Yeah, then make the swap. And then, okay, like, these plastic water bottles, like I can easily switch over to a stainless steel water
That's a
bottle. Like,
great.
just little things like that, they add up.
Yeah.
So I love that you said that, because I think that's such an important thing to bring up.
Yeah, yeah. I think that empowers people. I think that making it easy and digestible, and that's what we ultimately want for everyone. But you need the base of education. You need to know that it's a problem so that then you start making these changes. So yeah, that's where the education piece comes in.
So important, so important. So the vast majority of a lot of these different chemicals, like they weren't even around 100 years ago, right? And I correct me if I'm wrong, but there's about 350,000 chemicals in production and use worldwide that may be allowed to get used in our products without us even being aware of that. Is that correct?
Correct. And not only that, these are chemicals that haven't even had to pass through like safety standards or
Mm-hmm.
testing or anything, the majority of them. And then you add to that, there are chemicals that are being used. When I say this, it just blows my mind that no one really knows even exists. Like I'll read research papers about, not too long ago, they were studying the water off Cape Cod, and the scientists were saying that they knew because of the molecular structure that there were these PFAS chemicals, which we'll talk about later. It's a family, a type of chemical, but they didn't know what PFAS chemicals those were because they had never seen them before. They weren't registered anywhere, meaning some company, someone invented this PFAS, started using it. It has migrated into the water, drinking water, but no one knows what that is. No one knows if it's good, if it's bad. No one's testing it. No one even knows it exists. So, it's a huge problem. I mean, a lot of these chemicals are in our bodies, because they do migrate into our bodies. It's interesting when you start studying the different chemicals. It's interesting to see there are some chemicals that you can kind of your body can metabolize. You can get rid of these chemicals, which I always find empowering because that means that, these specific chemicals are really harmful for your health. But if you stop being exposed to them, they're going to get out of your body and not going to do any harm. There's other chemicals that will linger there for years and years. But I always say, well, let's focus on the ones that you can actually get rid of, because that's always a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. And bringing up just the word environmental chemicals, environmental toxins, a lot of these words just kind of get thrown around a lot. And so maybe we can start with contextualizing, like, what are environmental chemicals? Like, what's the definition of these
Question.
environmental toxins? And then, because I guess everything is a chemical, right? So like there's good and there's bad. So I guess,
Yeah.
like, what are, like, because the focus of this conversation will be around ones that specifically disrupt our hormones. So maybe we can talk about these EDCs and and those in relationship with environmental chemicals.
Okay, that's a good question. Because to your point, there are natural occurring chemicals that are harmful,
Hmm.
or that can be found. You can have like cadmium or lead naturally found in soil. Um, although technically those probably came from contamination. So, if we're focusing on on endocrine disrupting chemicals, these are chemicals that specifically affect our hormones, right? Our endocrine system. Now, these chemicals can also affect other systems, but the
Mhm.
thing with the endocrine system, I think a lot of us don't understand how vital the endocrine system is to our overall health. I mean, I know I didn't when I first started studying this years ago. And the reality is that with the endocrine system, it's all these hormones that are balancing everything in your health, in your body. And any little thing that's a little bit off can have big effects, for lack of a better way of saying it, a tiny bit off. So the problem with endocrine disrupting chemicals is that you're exposed to them and they're pretending to be, let's say, estrogen,
Mhm.
a common chemical. And then the problem is that then your body thinks that you're being exposed to estrogen. And then that causes craziness inside your system. And this can happen with different endocrine disrupting chemicals that work on different hormones. You have some that affect your thyroid, others that will affect testosterone, et cetera, et cetera. Um, the
Mhm.
concern is there's a couple of concerns. There's a lot of concerns. One is that there are a whole lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and we can start listing the more common ones, but there are many and they are very common. So you're never just exposed to one of them. You're always exposed to a lot of them. A cocktail of them is how I like to say. So that's a problem because not only do we know that one endocrine disrupting chemical can affect us this way, but we also know that when it mixes with other endocrine disruptors, your body reacts in a different way.
Mhm.
Just like another issue with endocrine disruptors is that some endocrine disruptors, for example, BPA is a common one that we all know about, it can affect our body in one way at a very tiny amount. So very, very low levels, like a drop in like an Olympic sized pool level, like that can affect our body in one way. But in high doses, it can affect our body in a completely different way. So all of these are also like challenges to studying these chemicals. Um, but the takeaway is that endocrine disrupting chemicals can affect our bodies in very low amounts. And they are found, these are man-made chemicals. Yeah, all of them are man-made chemicals that are, they've been manufactured, they've been made, they've been invented to, for the most part, make our life more comfortable, like in a way, if you kind of, when we go through them, you'll see. And yet they are doing a whole lot of harm. And then they not only contaminate your body, but they're contaminating the environment in general. So it's a whole cycle. Then it gets into your food chain, into the water, into the animals. So it's beyond our ecosystem. It's actually a whole big problem.
Yeah, and you brought up a really great point that was something I wanted to make sure I mentioned as well in the context of this whole conversation regarding environmental toxins is that chronic like low dose exposure. It's not like we're talking about like these heavy acute large exposures that we're getting, which those are obviously not good as well, but we're talking about these ones that we are getting exposed to multiple amounts of them, but in very tiny, small doses, like throughout the day, throughout the weeks, that end up adding up and overwhelming our body's ability to detoxify. And you also brought up another great point about the hormone system, that it does not take much to disrupt it. And you're talking about one tiny little drop of BPA in an Olympic sized swimming pool, enough to be able to affect our hormone system. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's a really important point, I think, to kind of lay the groundwork before we start diving into some specifics
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I think that, to that point, I think years ago, in fact, even like 15 years ago when I started doing this, there was still a lot in the scientific community and in the medical community that would tell you, oh, don't worry, because the amount of BPA, just for picking on BPA today,
Yeah.
it's very low. It's a safe dose, right? But the problem, and because the thought was the dose makes the poison. But the reality is that the dose doesn't make the poison because A, a very tiny minute dose can affect our body. And as we were saying, it's this cocktail effect. It's this, none of us are just
Mhm.
we don't live in a bubble, so that we're not just, not even in my house, and I'm very diligent to eliminate toxins. It's not just one toxin. So
Right.
the problem is that our bodies, and this is where we see all these modern days, or a lot of modern day, health issues with autoimmunity and all. It's because our bodies are just so burdened by all these
Mhm.
chemicals that didn't exist 2 generations ago. I mean, even when we were born, it's very different than babies being born today. We were exposed to less chemicals. And I think people tend to think, oh no, but there was like leaded paint in the 70s. I don't know, and yeah, that's true, but there's much more chemicals being used
Mhm.
today than if you were born in the 70s, for example. So
Yeah.
it's really, I think a lot of us don't realize how bad the situation is. I mean, that's really what it is. And our bodies are naturally able to detoxify from chemicals as long as they're not like overburdened.
Yeah.
Because when they're overburdened, they're like, what do we do? What do we do? What do I do? I can't deal with this amount.
Yes.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah. The last thing our body wants to do in terms of healing is when it's feeling overburdened by a multitude of different things, it wants to fight off whatever is going on in our system. And oftentimes, too, our body's detox capacities, like you've been mentioning, just end up shutting down and not able to detoxify anything out. And then we are further getting exposed to things, which then accumulate and creating more chronic symptoms. So I love that you brought that piece up.
Exactly.
And with the detoxing piece, this leads me to wanting to kind of start with um, a part of the house that we spend a third of our lives in. It's where we sleep every night, our bedrooms. And when we're sleeping, it's when we're actively detoxing, like you've been bringing up. So I would love to just start and just kind of like lay the groundwork for a couple of different environmental chemicals that are endocrine disrupting that are found within the bedroom, very common ones, and maybe some swaps people can start to look into making.
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought that up, because I do think that when you're starting to make changes in your home, it's really smart to just like focus on your particular routine and kind of figure out
Yeah,
like where do you spend the most time?
right.
What do you do? What do you eat the most? That's a great
Yeah,
place to start. So bedrooms is always going to be number one there, that, and usually like the kitchen. So in the bedroom, I always say, well, let's focus on where your head and body are closest to, right? So that's your
mm-hmm.
bed, your immediate area around your bed. Now we know that some conventional mattresses can they still contain flame retardant chemicals,
They do.
and those can be endocrine disruptors. The easiest solution for there is finding one that doesn't contain a flame retardant chemical. I'll
Mm-hmm.
also say conventional mattresses also contain foams. Now, whereas those aren't necessarily endocrine disruptors, they're not good chemicals for us, to be breathing in at a very close range. And the thing with polyurethane foam, not only is the problem that it's it can ignite very easily, which is why you need those
Mm-hmm.
flame retardant chemicals, but it's also releasing VOC. So you're breathing all that in. It's petrochemicals, it's just like nasty stuff. So my number one recommendation will always be, as soon as you can afford it, transition over to an organic mattress.
Mm-hmm.
The main thing that you're getting rid of here is there's going to be no flame retardants. There will be no, sometimes conventional mattresses have been found to contain PFAS chemicals, particularly for kids, because they put like for waterproofing and stuff like that. So you don't want that. You don't want to be breathing that in. You don't want the foams, the polyurethane foam. So those are the main thing, the first switch that I would do. I also like to pay attention to your actual bed frame, because again, it's such close proximity. If it's wood, that's the ideal. If it's upholstered, I had for years an upholstered bed frame without realizing that not only is there polyurethane foam there and likely some flame retardants, but nowadays most upholstered furniture still contains PFAS chemicals, because this is what most people want. You want something that's stain proof, water resistant. And these are some of the worst chemicals. These are the chemicals that's Teflon chemicals are all PFAS chemicals, endocrine disruptors also. So, that's something that I would always consider looking into. Um, a lot of times I get clients who are like, well, I can't afford a new bed frame and a new mattress. So there's ways around it. Number one, you can definitely get like some sort of a natural latex or a wool, kind of like a oh gosh
Oh, like a mattress pad?
like a mattress pad. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's just bringing a little bit of, you can change your pillows to more natural pillows also. And I'd say the single most important thing in any bedroom is to vacuum constantly. And it's such a simple thing to do. And this is all over your house, but particularly in your bed area under the bed that sometimes doesn't get vacuumed. And the reason for this is that these chemicals that are in our furniture, for example, or in our mattress, they migrate into the air. Migrate just means they get kind of released into the air and then they settle on the dust in our homes, which we then breathe in. So vacuuming consistently, vacuuming your mat. If you don't have your an organic mattress, just vacuuming that mattress, routinely, and just vacuuming and keeping a dust-free sleeping area really can do a lot. Like a lot of benefit, can really benefit you. You also want to open the windows in your bedroom as often as possible so that you're getting any chemicals that are indoors out. Um, I like to play, it kind of depends on your bedroom, but flooring can make an issue. If you have a conventional new carpet, for example, you're going to find PFAS chemicals, you're going to find flame retardants, you're going to find phthalates and formaldehyde, and all of these are endocrine disruptors. And just bad chemicals. And those, again, do not stay on carpeting. They migrate out. So that's where, again, vacuuming comes a long way. Ideally, I would say get rid of carpeting if you can. A solid tile or solid wood floor is much better, environmentally speaking, than carpeting, but sometimes you can't do that. So you do what you can. I think those are my
I
main takeaways.
I love that you brought up what it is that we want to be looking for. So more organic materials like wool or organic cotton or latex in mattresses. Those can be expensive. So if somebody is unable to, if that's not in their budget right now, to get a mattress pad, which will be significantly less expensive, to then it's basically to be able to create space between your body absorbing it, correct? So that way someone can look to decreasing their exposure that way. And then third, you're bringing up making sure that if you do have these different chemical burden products or things that are in the room, to just vacuum. I love that because yes, those things migrate into the dust. We're walking by it. The dust just flies into the air. We absorb it into our system. So opening windows, everything. So that's absolutely wonderful.
So there's actually a lot of research that has looked at dust inside homes, and it turns out that dust in our homes, and we're talking about across the United States, is really toxic. It's just full of these chemicals. They're coming from our furniture, they're coming from everyday products, they're also coming from just like construction material. So dusting is just always super important, and beyond having to buy a vacuum, it's something that's free. So it's something that almost everyone has at home anyway. And obviously, cleaning with like a moist rag also. But super important. And yeah, doesn't require buying
Yeah.
anything that you probably already don't have.
Do you have a recommendation on specific types of vacuums that might be best for being able to clean up the room? Because I know that a lot of conventional vacuums won't contain like the proper filter or the vacuum seal that we need to be able to prevent like what might be getting
Yeah. I mean,
extruded out.
you definitely want one with a HEPA filter,
Mhm.
and that's like the key. Because the reality is that otherwise, a vacuum without a HEPA filter will vacuum up and then often release a lot of it back out into your environment. So not really helping. The HEPA will just make sure that everything that's vacuumed in kind of gets stuck in there, is
Mhm.
filtered. So that would be my recommendation. And I mean, I want to say there are other things we can definitely do in the bedroom. You can get an air filter if you're going to invest in an air filter. studies have shown that it actually can help people in sleep quality, just to have an air filter in the home, and especially in the bedroom. And that can also help with dust and just environmental toxins that are always in our air. So that's something else that we can also do in the bedroom. And of course, sheets, and you can take it to the next step, but I'm just saying, like, at a very basic level, those are the things I would focus on.
Something else that I wanted to dive into when you mentioned carpeting. So, are there? I'm just super curious. Is there any non-toxic carpets, or are they all? Because I know the problem with carpets too is that they just tend to harbor a lot more of the dust, a lot more things that we
Yeah.
might be tracking in if we have pets, things like that. So, I know that's a separate issue, and that's where
Yeah.
vacuuming also comes into handy. But
Yeah.
yeah, are there any
Yeah.
good
There are.
carpet brands? Oh, that's great. Okay,
There
good. So
are.
that's something
Yeah.
people can
So
look into if
the
they
problem,
still
yeah,
want
the
that.
problem with like wall to wall carpeting, right? Not area rugs, but wall to wall carpeting
Hmm.
is, it's not only that it harbors all that, but the my main concern really is that there are adhesives underneath. So you have a lot of chemicals being used to like stick it right to the floor, basically. That's not a good way of saying it, but
Yeah.
and then they're usually treated, the top is always treated with like PFAS chemicals for stain and
Hmm.
waterproofing. And usually it's all flame retardants too. So there are some organic ones. There's two companies. There's one called Organic Weave, and then there's another one which the name escapes me. I have it in my blog. I could send it to you. But there are alternatives. They are pricier for sure. For area rugs, there are also a lot more options because you could definitely go with the organic option, which is the best.
Hmm.
But those are also more pricey. The other option is you can just go with something that's like a natural material, a wool. Usually wool won't have flame retardants or PFAS chemicals added. You want to look for something that doesn't have like a backing glued onto it. So these are, even like a jute rug, all of these more natural materials. You want to avoid the polyester, which actually nowadays is hard because most rugs, area rugs, are made out of polyester. And polyester, I mean, we'll get into it. Actually, I'll hold up on that one because polyester is one of my least favorite materials, because of how nasty it is for our health. But that's something you want to avoid.
Okay, I'm going to put a note in that to make sure we bring that up towards the end of the conversation.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's all such good information. Thank you for the referrals for the two non-toxic carpet companies that you know, because I get a lot of questions about that, and I
Yeah.
actually was very unaware of which companies might be helpful, might have
A little
some of the
better.
better options. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So thank you. Right before we move on from the bedroom, the last thing I wanted to touch on was a point you brought up earlier was the bed frame and looking for like more solid wood options. So I know that that tends to be a little pricier as well. So, and the problem with a lot of like MDF board or plywood, right, is because they are typically releasing a lot of volatile organic compounds, correct?
Yeah.
So, could you dive
Formaldehyde.
into that? And if somebody is getting, let's say, a new product, like what can they do to help? Obviously, vacuuming, wet dusting is important, but is there
Yeah.
something they can do to
Well,
help it
yeah.
off
The
gas a
the
little bit
problem
beforehand?
Yeah, the problem with anything that's part composite wood, right? Composite wood is anything that's not solid
Mm-hmm.
wood. It's You have plywood, you have MDF, different types. The problem is that, for example, in plywood, it's layers of solid wood that are glued together, and that glue releases formaldehyde. Now, there are emission standards in the United States that are actually very strict. That's the good, the good thing. We actually have, surprise, surprise, one of the strictest formaldehyde emission standards in the world. So that's really amazing, and it's the law. So actually, everyone, any piece of particle, um, composite wood that you're buying has to meet those standards here in the United States. But having said that, those items will release VOCs, specifically formaldehyde, for a
Mm-hmm.
long time. And most of you guys have probably smelled it. If you buy something that has particle board or MDF, it's kind of has like kind of like a sweet smell. I don't know how to describe
Mm-hmm.
it, but we all have smelled new wood,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what you can do is you could leave it somewhere, either ideally not inside your house, but maybe in a garage, or depending on the weather and how big your item is, you can leave it outside, somewhere that's well ventilated, so that it kind of airs out. The majority of the formaldehyde and the VOC leaching will take place at the first 2 or 3 weeks. And then it comes down drastically. It'll continue releasing this, but it will bring it down drastically. So if you can just let it off gas for a while, a couple of weeks, and this goes for any kind of wooden, particle board or MDF
Mhm.
item that you have at home or that you buy new, brand new, that's always a good idea. Um, the other option is if you do have an air filter, just, have it on while you're sleeping on it. I would never advise if it smells a lot. I mean, I think our nose is such a great, um,
Yeah.
it can really, it's a tool that we have to identify harmful toxins too, because anything that smell, not anything, but most things that smell,
Mhm.
if it smells very strong, I wouldn't sleep there. I would try to kind of let that air out a little bit.
Okay. Oh, that's such great advice because I knew that we were supposed to be airing it out. I didn't realize it was like 2 or 3 weeks. So that's really good to know,
Yeah.
like a good tip for people to be able to, if they are going to end up purchasing that, just to let it at least do that and then have an air filter, vacuum, things like that. So that's all great tips. Um, you have been talking about PFAS for like you've been bringing it up here and there. So I would really love to dive into that as our next endocrine disrupting chemical to talk about. So I know they're commonly found in a lot of stain resistant items. And so that's where a lot of our contact comes into when we are exposed to these. So I'd love for you to dive into them, what they are, and I guess some ways that we can make some good swaps to be able to avoid
Yeah.
them.
So PFAS chemicals, I think, are one of the chemicals that overwhelm everyone the most. So I'll start there, just giving you a warning, because of the fact that they're found everywhere, and we're going to talk about exactly where when I say everywhere. It's really hard to really avoid them completely. So the best we can do is reduce. And then there's the issue that the way PFAS chemicals work, unlike other chemicals that I mentioned, PFAS chemicals don't break down. So once you have them in your body, some of them can take 30 years. They'll just be there. Whatever you were exposed to will be there 30 years later before the
Mhm.
half-life. So that's not even that means that in 30 years they're gone, but it starts to reduce. And because you're constantly exposed to them, our levels are pretty high. So that's the downside, the Debbie Downer side of PFAS chemicals. Now, PFAS chemicals are, as you mentioned, these are chemicals used as stain resistant, grease resistance, water resistance. Originally, when we first heard about PFAS chemicals, it was Teflon. That's where we first started using them as consumers in our homes. And so anything that was nonstick, that everyone in the 80s was like, oh my gosh, the best thing ever, nonstick pans. And even today, it's still being used. The other day, actually, I just posted, there's this something that I thought was still relatively rare. It's called Teflon flu. And basically, when you're cooking with a Teflon pan at a high heat, the gases that it emits into the air, which are you're basically
Mhm.
absorbing, like you're breathing in
Yeah.
harmful chemicals that are cancer causing. But when it's at a very high level, it causes flu like symptoms. And Teflon flu symptoms have gone up in the last 20 years. It's at the highest rates in 20 years, which blows my mind because here what I thought people were migrating away, from using nonstick pots and pans with Teflon. Apparently not. So all of this is to say that the first thing that I would recommend to avoid or to reduce your exposure to PFAS is switching out your cookware. A lot of us who are still using nonstick pans have a really hard time at first switching because they think that they're not going to be able to cook, that it's going to be a mess to clean up. But the good news is that there's some really good alternatives that we can use that are also nonstick. You have cast iron, which I personally love.
Me too.
Um, yeah, it's and you know what? It took me a long time to even try it. It really took me like a good 8 years from the moment I heard about cast iron to like really embracing it and using it daily because I thought it was just hard to clean, and it's really not. It's just wonderful to use. And then stainless steel can also be used really. easily if you know how to use it. Glass, is the other alternative that I would recommend. So I would say, you don't want to be cooking organic food or the healthiest food in the world on a Teflon pan, because then all these bad chemicals that are cancer causing, they're endocrine disruptors, are going to be migrating into the food you're eating. So you just spent all this money on organic, so it doesn't make sense. So that's like the first switch that I would say. The other place where we see PFAS chemicals, there's a lot. Number two of priority, I'd say, and this actually could be number one, is in our water supply. Unfortunately, just about everyone's water, if you're getting it from, from city water, has PFAS chemicals. It's rare to find one that really doesn't. And I'd say 100% probably do, because again, we can't test for all PFAS. So it's fair to say that it's all contaminated. So finding the best quality filter that you can get is really important. Not only for PFAS, because water contains a lot of other chemicals, but PFAS is honestly one of my main concerns in terms of chemicals to avoid. Now, what I've seen in the research is that there's two types of water filtration systems that work the best against PFAS, to filter out PFAS, and that's a multi-stage carbon. So that's, for like a drinking water. So you'll have this under your sink, and it'll be 2 or 3 stages of carbon filtration, or a reverse osmosis, which will take everything out, but you also have to make sure it's remineralizing, because you need some good minerals in your water. So that's a high priority source of PFAS chemicals. Another source of PFAS chemicals in our homes are performance fabric. So we talked a little bit about that when we were talking about upholstered, right, bed frames. But think sofas, think window treatments, carpeting. All of these nowadays are performance, because anything that's labeled as stain resistant, grease resistant, water resistant, that will likely have PFAS. Now, there are some newer technologies now being used. So you could always, what I find is that if there's a company that's making a performance fabric product and it doesn't contain PFAS, they're always so proud about it that they will specify it's PFAS free. Like, I don't think I've run across one that doesn't say PFAS free. So usually it's pretty obvious. But if you have any questions, you could always ask customer service, does this contain PFAS chemicals? But yeah, I mean, those are the main sources, but there's other sources, eating, actually food, processed food is one of our main sources to PFAS chemicals. The reasoning for this is, on one hand, you have packaging which can contain PFAS, because it can be used again, like it could be like if you're getting a pizza delivered, right? Like the box, which is anti-grease, or there might be a paper there for bakery paper that's anti-grease, that can contain PFAS chemicals. But also sometimes with processed foods, even when it's organic processed foods, you have machinery, like the manufacturing might have PFAS chemicals there, some sort of a coating on something, and it migrates into the food. So it's really, that's like a tricky one, because you would think that you're buying better ingredients, and you are, but all processed foods can be a source of PFAS chemicals. It's not that they all are, but they can be. So reducing, focusing on fresh and reducing processed foods is another great tip that you can do.
Oh, these are all such great points. And so what I'm just going to kind of summarize it for people, because a lot of these are those stain resistant, water resistant things. So it's kind of looking for, and like non-stick, like you said. So that's like a lot of kind of like catchphrases to really look out for, right? Okay. And so switching out what you're cooking your food on, because that's the direct exposure that you're ingesting. Water filtration, like we talked about, furniture, that's a really great thing to look into. And the food packaging, which I definitely want to dive into that with you at some point as well. I'm excited. But the one thing I want to go back to is with the water filtration. We have a reverse osmosis that we use to and we remineralize our water too. So I love that you said that. That's what we've been using for years, and we love it. So, on the topic of water filtration, what about filtering the water in your shower or like bathtub? Do you have I'm assuming that you probably recommend to do that as well to reduce exposure, and that's exposure to other contaminants too in the water
Yeah.
supply. But that's probably a
Yeah.
good one too.
Yeah. I think that, yes, definitely. I think that the problem that I always have here is
Yeah.
that I don't always mention it right off the bat because a whole house filtration system is very expensive. And the reality is that it's just not in the cards for a lot of families. If it is in the cards for you, I definitely recommend it. Our skin is our biggest organ, it absorbs everything. Especially if you're taking long baths or showers, this is something that will add up. And again, we're not just talking about PFAS, but you also have other contaminants from chlorine, chloramine, just there's so many chemicals that can be in our water and that are often, it depends where you live, etc. Um, One thing that I think is a smart thing to do if you're considering any filtration system, but specifically a home one, you could always test your water to see what's in there. Some people always ask me about, well, what about those like point of use filters, in the shower that exist? Those can be good as like softeners, if you have hard water and stuff like that. The problem with those, and they can actually be very effective with chlorine if your water's treated with chlorine, but not
Mhm.
everyone's water is treated with chlorine.
Yeah.
So if yours is treated with chloramine, it's not as effective. So,
Mhm.
it's good to know what's in your water first before you determine what kind of filtration system you need. But yeah, if it's in your budget to have a whole water filtration, yes. Usually those are carbon based. Very rarely, it would just really be ridiculously expensive to have a whole house reverse osmosis. I've heard of it, but it's
Yeah.
not a common occurrence. So whether or not that's being effective towards like a PFAS, it's not really clear.
Yeah.
So that's why I still recommend if you get, I mean, the bottom line is you can have a whole house water filter, but you still need the drinking water filter. You
Yeah.
need both. And so the priority is the drinking water, and you're also using this to cook. It's not just for drinking
Yes.
water. You want to make sure that's the water you're using to cook, to clean your produce, things like that. And then, the whole house also.
It's great because a lot of this conversation is revolving, and it's what I love that you keep bringing up and going back to is we want to just really reduce our exposure to things that we are just getting into contact with more and more often. So, like where we're sleeping, what we're coming into contact with on our skin, like you mentioned, it's our largest organ, but also like what are we cooking with? We eat 3 meals a day, maybe some snacks. We drink 8 to 10 cups of water a day. So, these are all things that we're getting
Really
exposed to
important.
continuously. So, yeah, that's so wonderful that you've been bringing that up. And going into the topic of like food packaging, I think bringing up like BPA and phthalates are a really great point here because alongside the PFAS chemicals, because a lot of this can be found to contaminate a lot of the different things that we might be storing our food in or the food packaging that we are that our food is getting delivered in. So I'd love to maybe talk kind of still staying in the kitchen, talking
Yeah.
about things that do come into contact with our food and some ways that we can just start to avoid those
Yeah.
too.
I actually, I love detoxing a kitchen
Yeah.
because I do think that it's one of the places in the home where you can make the biggest impact
Mm-hmm.
without spending huge amounts of money. For example, if you're switching out your cookware, you don't need a whole set. You just really need one or two or maybe three, pots and pans. And that's really all you really need to start
Yeah.
with. So there's so many little things that we can do in the kitchen. So in terms of packaging, I'd say one of the first things that you should be switching out if you haven't already are any containers that you use to store your food.
Mm-hmm.
If you're using plastic containers, these containers are going to, even at room temperature, will leach chemicals into your food. If you're heating them in a microwave, the leaching goes up significantly, so that you're getting the chemicals inside the plastic into your food, but you're also getting tons of microplastics into your food.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't even know the effects fully of microplastic. This is something that we're still starting to
Mm-hmm.
research, but we know that micro and nanoplastics make their way into every single one of our organs.
Yeah.
So we know that that's not going to be good. Eventually, when we have that science, it's going to be not a good thing. So reducing your exposure to microplastics is also key.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's like one simple thing, because just buying, glass containers can, you buy one, they last forever, and it's great. The same thing if you're packing a lunch, for the office, for school. Glass containers, stainless steel containers are what you want to be using, and ditch the plastic. And I'd also say, I always tell people, I have containers, I have my two older boys, my 14-year-old, and then I have an 11-year-old. They have these like stainless steel bento like boxes that they've been using. We've had them for 9 years, and they're, these are not gentle boys. And they're still with us. Now the high schooler doesn't want it anymore because it's not cool, but my younger daughter will start using it. They last forever. So they are maybe a little bit more expensive than the plastic ones up front, but they'll last forever. And they're not exposing you to any kind of plastic chemicals. So in terms of plastic chemicals, your main concerns are hard, clear plastic will likely contain either BPA or a family member of BPA, right? Because a lot of people are like, well, but it says BPA free. BPA free, unfortunately, means that it doesn't have BPA, but it probably has its cousins chemicals, which is what I call them, BPS, BPF. And the takeaway is that these chemicals do the same thing that BPA does. They're as harmful as BPA is. So you just want to avoid plastic. Then you have phthalates can be in softer plastics. PVC will contain phthalates, high levels of phthalates, and even plastics that say PVC, I mean, phthalate free, can still contain other phthalates because they don't all have to be tested for. So it's just really tricky with regulations and all that. So your safest bet is just to avoid the plastic. Now, in terms of processed foods and packaging, it's a little tricky. We just mentioned phthalates. So phthalates are these like chemicals that are used to make PVC like kind of bendable and flexible. They're also used in fragrance, which we can talk about later. Anything that has a synthetic fragrance will have a phthalate. And the problem and our main source of phthalates nowadays is actually not plastic and it's not fragrance, it's processed foods, which I mentioned with the PFAS. And again, it can also be organic processed foods. The problem with processed foods is that they're going through machinery, they're going through people that have PVC,
Like like
uh,
like what they're using to like wear like their equipment wear.
yes. Yes, equipment wear, things like that. And all of those phthalates are migrating into the food during the whole packaging process, and then that's what you're eating. So the best thing that you can do, and I know that it's hard because we all like to snack, but the best thing that I would encourage you to do, especially if you really do need to reduce these, if you have a health issue, is reduce processed foods. It's not only the ingredients, but it's the chemicals. I always say, I've been saying lately that when we talk about what's healthy in terms of food, yes, we have to pay attention to sugar and we have to pay attention to the ingredients and all of that. But I think that we need to start talking about chemicals in food also, because it's a reality. It's not just pesticides. Is it organic or not organic? That's important. And pesticides are also endocrine disrupting chemicals. So that's definitely important, but it doesn't end there. There's other chemicals in our food nowadays. And that's like a topic for its own podcast.
I know.
We could talk
It
about
really
food for
is.
years. But yeah, so that would be another takeaway. And then finally, just packaging from, if you're someone who likes to dine out, who likes to order in, I get it, we do it too, but do be mindful, because most of that packaging that you're going to get food delivered in will also contribute to some sort of plastic. It's usually a plastic. Even the cardboard like boxes and stuff like that, they have like a liner of plastic right in there. So you might not see it or realize it, but the plastic is there, and those chemicals that are endocrine disruptors are also migrating out. So
And
if you
it's kind of
minimize plastic, which can be done, you don't have to eliminate it, but if you can minimize it significantly, it's a huge, huge help for the overall toxic burden.
alongside the takeout food. You just reminded me of another one is like coffee shops. Like when you're getting like a to-go coffee, if you actually, it's like, it might look like a nice cardboard material on the outside, or like a paper material, but then on the inside you can see that like thin layer of coating there.
Yeah.
That yeah. So I always think
Yeah.
about that too when I try to opt for not getting that. So, but then I know that
Yeah, yeah,
um,
or taking your
in
own
that realm,
ideally. You can't always do
yes,
it, but or at a minimum not putting the lid on, which helps a little bit
yes,
too.
definitely.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard, it's hard if you're especially with takeout or
I
it's
know.
hard you don't always you're not always prepared with your, to go cup. It's a good habit to get into. But yeah, minimizing is the key.
Yeah, and I love that it keeps going back to that is we can't stress over absolutely everything, but we can do our best to minimize what we can. And if we don't do it one day, like that's okay. Like the majority of the time that we're
Yeah.
more aware
Big
and trying to
picture.
do the best we can. Yeah, yeah. Kind of going back to the food packaging, I do have one more question. So with what about like frozen fruits and vegetables? Like that's so
Mhm.
popular. It's so easy because we can just like open the bag up, quickly heat it up, like hopefully in like a cast iron pan or like a stainless
Yes.
steel pan, not in
Yeah.
plastic. So, but what are your thoughts on those in terms of because you keep emphasizing sticking with as fresh food as we
Yeah.
can. So I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I just want to hear it.
Well, you know what? Here's the thing. I'll be honest. I've never seen research specifically finding, I haven't really seen research on frozen foods showing thyroid levels or PFAS levels. So I don't know if it hasn't been done or it just hasn't come across me. And I might actually look it up after this podcast because I haven't seen it. However, considering that the issue with processed foods and the ones that we've found have high levels of PFAS, and phthalates, specifically phthalates, it usually comes from manufacturing equipment. So the idea is that anything that goes through any kind of machinery or any kind of process, there's a higher likelihood that it's going to be contaminated. So
Mhm.
it's not something that people are adding to it on purpose, but there is that option. But having said all of that, and it's sometimes low tox living is like balancing out things and kind of figuring out, well, where's, what's more important, this or that. And in this case, I'd say, frozen organic vegetables and
Mhm.
fruit can be one of the ways, an affordable way, a more affordable way
Yeah.
to access this type of food that's organic. So the nutritional benefits of buying that, a frozen organic fruit or vegetable versus maybe buying the conventional one, maybe the benefit is to buy the frozen one. So it's
Right.
kind of a hard call. I don't have
Mhm.
really an answer for you there.
Yeah.
But those are the things that I would think about before making a judgment.
Yeah, no, that's great. Because I'm busy. I know you're busy. Like, well, most of us are busy. We live busy lives, and I find that during the week, it's so nice to be able to have like my frozen fruits that I can put into like my bowl of like oatmeal or my
Yeah.
smoothie in the morning, or like maybe like frozen broccoli and vegetables, all organic that I just will quickly put into like my cast iron pan to like heat up, and I'll have it for like my lunch later or something. And my concern was around it. I had just thought of it right before this episode was yeah, just like because they always usually come in like the plastic bags. And so that's
Yeah.
where I was thinking too. And I was like, what? But I was like, well, again, it's you do the best you can. And you're like you had mentioned, you're at
Yeah.
least getting the nutrients in and like good
Yeah.
quality food, whole foods. So I think
Yeah.
that, like you said, it's
And I
probably a
mean that,
balancing act.
generally speaking, also chemicals, plastic tends to migrate at a higher temperature. So yes, it can migrate at room temperature, but frozen, it's a little bit, it's lower levels. So all of those things can kind of come into
Okay.
play when you're making the choices.
Okay.
In the kitchen in general, for food, I always say like diversity is your friend. And I think any nutritional, advisor would say the same thing for different reasons because when you have a diverse diet, you're getting exposed to diverse vitamins and minerals and all the good things. But additionally, in terms of chemicals, the more you diversify, if you ever find out that that one product that you love ends up being high in phthalates or in PFAS or in lead or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, well, at least you know that it's not something that you're eating every day. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't recommend eating the same thing. There's very few things that I would recommend eating every single day. So the more that you can diversify, the better. also for environmental toxins, to avoid environmental toxins. I mean, recently, and we don't have to get into the actual food, but there's been a lot of talk about like cassava being high in lead, being found, it's not that it was just found that it's high in lead. It's always been high in lead. But people are coming to terms with that. And, a lot of people with gluten-free diets or health will eat cassava products, or rice also can be high in arsenic. So the more that you can kind of spread out and diversify, the better. It's not that you can't eat every, it kind of depends, but I think diversity is always a good idea.
Yeah, no, that's such a great tip because there's, again, it kind of almost comes into the context of we're just always getting exposed. There's all things that we're getting exposed to. And these foods that might contain higher amounts of lead or arsenic, they're still good for us nutritionally. And so maybe not sticking with that same food every day, but being able to kind of
Yeah.
diversify around it is really
Yeah.
important. And then just in general, getting all that nutrients that's supporting your gut microbiome and your liver and all these things that we need to support our body's ability to go back to
Bigger.
detoxing, right? Yeah. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
great. So, I would love to touch on pesticides next because that is something, again, found in the kitchen. And you actually, I found this out from you on your Instagram. You posted about, and I need to read it here. So you said there was a study regarding pesticides and PFAS and how 14% of all U.S. pesticides active ingredients are these PFAS chemicals, which that was very interesting
Mind
to
blowing.
me. Yeah, so there's just that PFAS, the pesticides. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about pesticides because those are
Yeah.
also endocrine disrupting among other things. And
Yeah.
just buying organic, I know, is a great way to be able to reduce exposure. But yeah, let's go ahead and turn the discussion
Yeah,
to that a little bit.
the topic of pesticides, it's a systemic issue, really. Like not only are pesticides not, they're designed to kill living organisms.
Yes.
So they're not great for our health, clearly. And there's a lot of science on this, but the additional information that we now have is that, there's a lot of PFAS in these pesticides. And we know that PFAS are really bad for our health. There's really no questions about that. So yes, definitely avoid it as much as possible. Now, I will say, you cannot avoid 100% of pesticides, even when you're buying organic fruits and vegetables. It's important to understand that because someone's going to tell you this at some point. Well, organic food also can be contaminated. Yes, it can definitely be contaminated. They use some approved pesticides that are not as bad, not as harmful, and it can be the water, the soil can be contaminated, the air, and it can migrate, but it's always going to be at much lower levels. So where you can buy organic, I do think it's money well spent. There are lists that a lot of people like to use. If you've heard of the Environmental Working Group, they have their Clean 15 and their Dirty Dozen. This is a list that they publish every year, and they basically help guide you in terms of what fruits and vegetables have the highest levels technically of pesticides, meaning those are the dirty dozens, the ones that you should really, really buy organic. And then the clean 15, the theory is that, it's the lower levels. So if you can't buy them organic, you can also buy them conventional.
Mhm.
Um, and that can help you a lot too. But yeah, pesticides are endocrine disruptors. They can, they've been linked to also like just their obesogens. So that means that these are
Mhm.
chemicals that are linked to making our, metabolic syndrome, but it's also just like making you fat. It's the propensity. And they can also be neurotoxic, and they can affect, well, against endocrine, our fertility. So they are the worst of the worst. So you have them in food, clearly. So yes, buy organic when possible. But you also have them around the house. A lot of people are still using pesticides around the house, not only to deal with ants or, but also just like in their gardens also. And, even if you live near a golf course or if you live near a park that is, massively spraying for pesticides, with pesticides, all of this can actually affect the air quality in your home. So, you don't have control over what happens outside of your house. If you do live near a golf course, I would recommend finding out. You can ask them what their schedule of like spraying is. And during those days or hours, you can just close your windows and just make sure you're not outside. And then you could just clean the outside afterwards. But you do have control over what you use in your home. And, I would definitely not use anything like Roundup, anything like that. You don't want to use anything. The less pesticides you can use, the better for everyone. And in terms of like ants and other critters, there's so much you can do without harmful pesticides. I have some blog posts on that, and you can just find it on the internet. There's so many effective ways, from using vinegar, baking soda, borax if you don't have pets or kids. There's a lot of things that you can do. So I would definitely always try that first, because you might think, oh, it's in a little corner of my house, it's not going to affect me, but it does become at some point airborne. It's always going to affect your home air and your health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such a good point. And when we're talking about like pesticides and PFAS and different plasticizers like the phthalates and the BPA and the VOCs, can you touch on, because earlier you were talking about how some of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, they don't stay in our bodies for very long. So those ones are like the best ones to try to we want to try to reduce our exposure to all types of things, but
Definitely.
it's good to try to reduce those, because then you're just reducing what you're getting exposed to.
Yeah.
Right. And on top of just supporting your body's detox capabilities.
Yeah.
So can we talk about maybe the ones that are in and out of our bodies super quick, but other ones that might stick around for a lot longer?
Yeah. So my favorite one, the one that you can get rid of the quickest is the bisphenols, the BPA. And one source of BPA that we didn't mention and is so common is so performance wear, so athletic wear, anything that's a mix of polyester and spandex almost always will have BPA levels. And again, it's something that we don't think about, but our skin is our biggest organ, and it's going to absorb whatever's being placed on it. And add to that, a lot of us just spend the whole day wearing, leggings or whatever. So, and you're also using it when you're sweating, which, opens the pores and all that. So that's another actual area. Like our closet can use a detox too. And it's one of the last things that we come to in the house, but that's one of the main places to start. In addition, polyester has other, like, the issues of microplastics. It leaches microplastics into the air, and when you dry it, it's the chemicals used to dye polyester are really, really harmful. You just need, if you imagine like a plastic, any polyester is plastic, right? It's just plastic in a thread. And then if you can imagine having to like dye a plastic bottle, it's not going to stick that easily, right? Like compared to like cotton, right? So the problem with polyester is that it just needs these harsher chemicals to actually absorb the dyes. So there's a ton of stuff, but BPA is one of the issues with polyester. When you have polyester and spandex, you're going to have BPA. So having said that, so switching out for BPA free in general, for switching out on plastics, that's one great way. And also just switching out what you're wearing on a daily basis. If you're wearing athletic wear, clothing, socks, for example, that are made out of polyester and spandex, I would recommend switching it out at least slowly to organic cotton, ideally, or just even 100% cotton, to get rid of that source of BPA. Other sources is like the thermal receipts in stores. Those are high sources of BPA, and canned foods. So that's one of the easiest, in my opinion, ways to avoid BPA. Plastic bottles also. If you're drinking water from plastic water bottles, that's something you want to switch out. Get yourself a good stainless steel or glass reusable bottle. Better for the planet, better for you. Phthalates, you can also reduce. It takes a little bit longer. And the best ways to do that, we spoke about processed foods. We spoke about any kind of like soft plastic you want to avoid. But also, we didn't speak about fragrance chemicals. So if you use home fragrances, like plugins, if you use sprays, if you use any kind of cleaning or personal care product that has a synthetic, synthetic is like a fake fragrance, anything that smells like roses or like pine or like lemon, and there's no real lemons in there, or essential oils,
Right.
that's going to contain phthalates, because phthalates are the chemicals that bind the fragrance to the product, right? Whatever it is, if it's a body oil, if it's a stuffed animal, which can contain fragrance, whatever it is, thiolate is required to bind those two. So that's a great way. Just not purchasing things that have fragrance is a great way to reduce your thiolate exposure. And I'd say take a good look at your personal care products, which we didn't talk about, but that's like a huge source of toxins like
Mm-hmm.
phthalates. Parabens are another one, which we didn't really talk about. It can be in food or in personal care products. And the good thing about personal care products is that it will be listed. So whereas fragrance chemicals are not listed, it's trade secret. All the other ingredients have to be, except fragrance chemicals. So you can identify the products that contain parabens and which don't. And usually they say paraben free.
Okay.
So you want to avoid those. Those are also endocrine disrupting chemicals. They've been linked to breast cancers and other cancers too, and they're pretty easy to avoid nowadays. And you can reduce your levels pretty quickly too. So those are the ones that I think are the easiest to get out
Mm-hmm.
of your system. The hardest one by far, it's the PFAS chemicals. Those just stay a long time. They're designed to stay in the environment, including inside your body, forever. They're called forever chemicals, and that's why, because they're meant to be there forever. So I still think it's really important to reduce the exposure to these, because although you can't detox from PFAS chemicals, unfortunately, you can, kind of like close the doorway into your body so that it's not getting, the levels inside your body aren't getting higher, higher, and higher,
Mm-hmm.
which is definitely beneficial.
Okay, thank you so much for mentioning that and for bringing up new endocrine disrupting ones that we didn't talk about, like the phthalates that are going to be found in like our fragrance items, as well as talking about parabens as well. And I love that you keep kind of going back to it's just a lot of the plasticizers, so like the BPA and the phthalates, or the bisphenol family. So the reason why these are because they can leach out so easily even at room temperature, because they're not as molecularly bound, correct? So that's why even at room temperature, but definitely heating or acidic foods, correct, can be
Yes.
leaching a lot of these out as well. Okay, that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
probably why it's good to not put anything hot into your blender if it's not a stainless steel blender, correct?
Right.
Because that's another way to get the leaching
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
large amounts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and again, for example, I always say, well, okay, how often are you doing it?
Right.
If you do it once every 3 months, it's not great,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not going to be your main source. But if it's something that you're doing every week, or for baby food, for example, every day, then yes, then you should
Yeah.
invest in that stainless steel
Mm-hmm.
or a blender or a glass one that they have for babies and stuff like that. But yes, I think it's
Yeah.
great to hopefully feel empowered and be like, I can look at what I'm using the most and let me start there. Let me focus on that, and everything else will come along, but let's focus on prioritizing,
Yes.
hopefully. And I think, it really comes to, I think we spoke a lot about a lot. But if you have, it's, avoid the plastic, choose stainless steel and glass when
Totally.
possible, avoid the performance fabrics when you can, choose natural fabrics when possible, or organic, and avoid the processed food, and choose
Yeah.
organic fresh foods when possible. And it's not that you have to live, and I keep on saying like the bubble. You don't have to live in a bubble, but you just have to make sure that your bubble is kind of
Yeah.
lower tox,
Mm-hmm.
so that you don't have to worry when you step outside. You'll be exposed to stuff outside of the house, but if you're doing a good job inside, indoors, it does go a long way for your health, because we're home
Yeah.
most of the time, or your office if you're in your
Exactly.
office all day. But
Mm-hmm. No, it's so true. And again, it's all about those small steps, right? Those small steps amount to huge changes. And so I love that you do keep bringing that up, because it's such an important piece. And again, too, like a lot of my audience, there are people that have been diagnosed or struggling with like mast cell activation syndrome or mold illness or things like that. So these hormone disrupting chemicals, they, again, going back to how that hormone system is so delicate, it doesn't take much to just tip that balance and create symptoms, can really create flares in a lot of individuals.
yeah,
And so by cleaning up the environment is such a huge way to be able to support your body and then reduce just that toxic burden in general. So I'm so glad that we had this conversation because you brought up so many amazing points, and I always like to just leave it with you. And is there any other tips or any other specific products or chemicals that we didn't touch on today that you wanted to mention before we kind of end the podcast?
I mean, again, I could talk about this for hours and there's a lot, but I think like I'd love the takeaway to be, and you spoke about this right now. It's, don't be overwhelmed, really just focus on one thing at a time because, even, especially if you're going through mast cell activation or any kind of, illness or any autoimmune disease, anything, it can be really overwhelming. There's a lot of factors you don't really have control over. It can be, all of that is scary and overwhelming. So don't let this part of the puzzle be overwhelming. This should be something that you should be empowered about, that you can actually make changes. These are concrete things that we can do that will benefit everyone's health regardless. So kind of try to focus on that so that it can empower you and help you instead of like bringing you down. And as we've been saying this whole time, the baby steps, just start with one thing, two things, and they will add up over, days, weeks, months. So yes, I'm always, I have my community. If you have any questions, you can always reach out. I do consulting if someone really needs the help, but there's so much that we can do on our own. So hopefully everyone feels empowered and can start making changes.
I love that. It all goes back to feeling empowered. It really does. Education, empowerment. There's so much good information out there now. If you just even like Google what is bisphenols, like you can find so much information, research articles on it. So I love that there's more awareness at least being brought to it. Yes, please.
As an add-on to what you're saying, I love that there's a lot of awareness too. And I think that that's really helpful. Also just in moving everything in terms of, pressuring companies to do better, et cetera. But if sometimes when there's just too much information, that can be overwhelming too. So I'd say, don't feel bad about maybe turning off social media or turning it off for a bit, because I sometimes obviously my social media feed is very skewed, but, sometimes when I'm getting, posts and reels talking about environmental chemicals that are harmful, sometimes they're presented in such a way by some people that is very alarming. And that can be really good for some people, but some people have a really hard time with those messages. I don't particularly love posting every day because I don't think that people need to be hearing about this every single day. I think that could be more harmful. But so my point is that if you need to turn it off, because stress can also be toxic, as we all know. Like if you need to take little breaks, it's okay. You can always start up again. Don't compare yourself to someone else's like low-tox living journey, because I've been doing this for 15 years. There's no way that it'll be the same. My home will be the same as your home if you're just starting out, right? So take the good, but kind of focus on yourself. This is not a comparison. This is not a race. This is you with yourself, with your home. And I think I think a lot of people get really overwhelmed because they don't realize that they're comparing themselves, but they are. So don't be, it's okay to take breaks. It's okay if it's not perfect. It's okay if you ate that processed food during, it's fine. Just, we do better when we know better, and do it slowly.
Oh my gosh, what a great point. Because yes, unfortunately too, like you said, there's a lot of great information, but there's a lot of fear mongering around different types of things that we might get exposed to. And sometimes it can be on just the smallest details of things too. And then that's just enough to create a lot of different stress when it's just something that you need to be focusing on more the bigger picture.
Yes.
And focus on what you can control on your own home and your own body. And I love that you brought that point up. So thank you.
Yeah.
That's absolutely wonderful. So where can people find you? Because again, like I mentioned in the beginning, you have so many great information, articles, blogs, things that you're always posting about. So yeah, where can people find you? What's your website?
So my website is threelittleplums.com. I just started a Substack. Substack is that I literally just started it this week. So, but I'm really excited because I want to grow that into almost like my new blog. I think I'm going to start. So that'll be really cool. I'll be able to share a lot of reviews and deeper dives into research, which I can't do on Instagram.
Right.
And of course, I'm on Instagram and I am pretty good. Not very good, pretty good with DMs. So if you ever have a question, you can reach out. Again, I'm also available for one-on-one consults. I love that. It's really great to be able to work one-on-one with families because you get to know them. And so, yes, so all of that, any which way that you would like. I'm there.
Various ways. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Aida. It was such a pleasure getting to learn from you and to hear everything that you've been spending the last 15 plus years researching. So thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you so much for this great conversation and for having me. Thanks.